The missing supermarket. The shift towards transience is even manifest in architecture, precisely that part of the physical environment that in the past contributed most heavily to man's sense of permanence. The child who trades in her Barbie doll cannot but also recognise the transience of buildings and other large structures that surround her. We tear down whole streets and cities and put new ones up at a mind-numbing rate. The average age of dwellings has steadily declined, writes E.F. Carter of the Stanford Research Institute, from being virtually infinite in the days of caves to approximately 100 years for houses built in United States colonial days to about 40 years at present. And Michael Wood, as an English writer, comments, "The American made his world yesterday and he knows exactly how fragile, how shifting it is. Buildings in New York literally disappear overnight, and the face of a city can change completely in a year." Novelist Louis Auchincloss complains angrily that the horror of living in New York is living in a city without a history. All 8 of my great-grandparents lived in the city, and only one of the houses they lived in is still standing. That's what I mean by the vanishing past. Less patrician New Yorkers, whose ancestors landed in America more recently, arriving there from Puerto Rico, the villages of Eastern Europe, or the plantations of the South, might voice their feelings quite differently. Yet the vanishing past is a real phenomenon, and it is likely to become far more widespread, engulfing even many of the history-drenched cities of Europe. Buckminster Fuller, the designer philosopher, once described New York as a continual evolutionary process of evacuations, demolitions, removals, temporarily vacant lots, new installations, and repeat. This process is identical in principle to the annual rotation of crops in farm acreage: ploughing, planting the new seed, harvesting, ploughing under, and putting in another type of crop. Most people look upon the building operation blocking New York streets as temporary annoyances, soon to disappear in a static peace. They still think of permanence as normal, a hangover from the Newtonian view of the future, but those who have lived in and with New York since the beginning of the century have literally experienced living with Einsteinian relativity. That children in fact internalise this Einsteinian relativity was brought home to me forcibly by a personal experience. Some time ago, my wife sent my daughter, then 12, to a supermarket a few blocks from our Manhattan apartment. Our little girl had been there only once or twice before. Half an hour later, she returned, perplexed. "It must have been torn down," she said. "I couldn't find it." It hadn't been. New to the neighbourhood, Karen had merely looked on the wrong block. But she is a child of the age of transience, and her immediate assumption that the building had been razed and replaced was a natural one for a 12-year-old growing up in the United States at this time. Such an idea would probably never have occurred to a child faced with the similar predicament even half a century ago. The physical environment was far more durable, our links with it less transient. The Economics of Impermanence. In the past, permanence was the ideal, whether engaged in handcrafting a pair of boots or in constructing a cathedral. All man's creative and productive energies went towards maximising the durability of the product. Man built to last. He had to. As long as the society around him was relatively unchanging, each object had clearly defined functions, and economic logic dictated the policy of permanence. Even if they had to be repaired now and then, the boots that cost $50 and lasted 10 years were less expensive than those that cost $10 and lasted only a year. As the general rate of change in society accelerates, however, the economics of permanence are, and must be, replaced by the economics of transience. First, advancing technology tends to lower the costs of manufacture much more rapidly than the costs of repair work. The one is automated, the other remains largely a handcraft operation. This means that it often becomes cheaper to replace than to repair. It is economically sensible to build cheap, unrepairable throwaway objects, even though they may not last as long as repairable objects. Second, advancing technology makes it possible to improve the object as time goes by. The second generation computer is better than the first, and the third is better than the second. Since we can anticipate further technological advance, more improvements coming at even shorter intervals, it often makes hard economic sense to build for the short term rather than the long. David Lewis, an architect and city planner with Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh, tells of certain apartment houses in Miami that are torn down after only 10 years of existence. Improved air conditioning systems in newer buildings hurt the rentability of those old buildings. All things considered, it becomes cheaper to tear down the 10-year-old buildings than to modify them. Third, as change accelerates and reaches into more and more remote corners of the society, uncertainty about future needs increases. Recognising the inevitability of change, but unsure as to the demands it will impose on us, we hesitate to commit large resources for rigidly fixed objects intended to serve unchanging purposes. Avoiding commitment to fixed forms and functions, we build for short-term use or alternatively attempt to make the product itself adaptable. We play it cool technologically. The rise of disposability, the spread of the throwaway culture, is a response to these powerful pressures. As change accelerates and complexities multiply, we can expect to see further extensions of the principle of disposability, further curtailment of man's relationships with things. The portable playground. There are other responses besides disposability that also lead to the same psychological effect. For example, we are now witnessing the wholesale creation of objects designed to serve a series of short-term purposes instead of a single one. These are not throwaway items. They are usually too big and expensive to discard, but they are so constructed that they may be dismantled if necessary and relocated after each use. Thus, the Board of Education of Los Angeles has decided that fully 25% of that city's classrooms will, in the future, be temporary structures that can be moved around as needed. Every major United States school district today uses some temporary classrooms. More are on the way. Indeed, temporary classrooms are to the school construction industry what paper dresses are to the clothing industry, a foretaste of the future. The purpose of temporary classrooms is to help school systems cope with rapidly shifting population densities, but temporary classrooms, like disposable clothes, imply man-thing relationships of shorter duration than in the past. Thus, the temporary classroom teaches something even in the absence of a teacher. Like the Barbie doll, it provides the child with a vivid lesson in the impermanence of her surroundings. No sooner does the child internalise a thorough knowledge of the classroom, the way it fits into the surrounding architecture, the way the desks feel on a hot day, the way sound reverberates in it, all the subtle smells and textures that individualise any structure and lend it reality, then the structure itself may be physically removed from her environment to serve other children in another place. Nor are mobile classrooms a purely American phenomenon. In England, architect Cedric Price has designed what he calls a Think Belt, an entirely mobile university intended to serve 20,000 students in North Staffordshire. It will, he says, rely on temporary buildings rather than permanent ones. It will make great use of mobile and variable physical enclosures. Classrooms, for example, built inside railway carriages so that they may be shunted anywhere along the 4-mile campus. geodesic domes to house expositions, air-inflated plastic bubbles for use as command posts or construction headquarters. A whole array of pick up and move temporary structures are flowing from the drawing boards of engineers and architects. In New York City, the Department of Parks has decided to build 12 portable playgrounds, small temporary playgrounds to be installed on vacant city lots until other uses are found for the land, at which time the playgrounds can be dismounted and moved elsewhere. There was a time when a playground was a reasonably permanent fixture in a neighbourhood, when one's children and even perhaps one's children's children might, each in their turn, experience it in roughly the same way. Super-industrial playgrounds, however, refuse to stay put. They are temporary by design.